Every 4 years in this country, when it comes to the presidential election, one of the big things that we hear about time after time after time is the Electoral College map. It is ultimately the way that our country determines who will be the next president of the United States. And I think over time people have grown to kind of understand the Electoral College system, but it can still be kind of confusing and frustrating for some. And especially if you were a Hillary Clinton supporter or a Democrat or anti Trump, the Electoral College system can be incredibly frustrating because it runs really counterculture to pretty much every other type of election at the city, state, and federal level that we do in this country, where typically it's man or woman with the most votes wins. In the case of the Electoral College, it's the man or woman that wins the most votes in specific states to get them to a certain number on a electoral map. It's a system we've had since the beginning. It's a system we continue to have in spite of all of its flaws. And every 4 years there's talk about it. And then, especially when certain individuals or certain segments of the population don't like the results of said presidential election, you always get to that inevitable talk of, is the Electoral College out of date? Is it time to change the way that we determine who is the president of the United States? Is it time for the Electoral College to be abolished? And I think it's an interesting discussion or conversation to have. And it's definitely a conversation worth having. Because if we want to believe the old American propaganda of the president is the most powerful and influential person in the entire world, and it's probably true, then we probably should have the most impeccable process for selecting said most powerful individual in the world. So let's take a look first. I think it's very important to understand the origins of the Electoral College and how it came to be. And it kind of paints the backdrop for, I think, the flaws of the system from its very beginning. The Electoral College was really set up in certain ways as a way to prevent direct election of the president by the people. Now, granted, when the country was first founded, it was only white landowners that could vote anyways. But with that said, it was a way to build, by the powers that be, a level of protection to where you could, in theory, give the people the voice, but at the same point in time, if you didn't like the direction they were going, you had enough infrastructure and protections in place that you could ultimately do what you wanted to do as the powers that be. Now, whether people want to admit that or not, of being a major reason why the Electoral College came to be, that was one of the major reasons. It was a way to give a chance for the people to hear their voice, but ultimately for the powers that be to do whatever the hell they wanted to and implement their own way of doing things. And that seems really kind of anti-democratic, doesn't it? Doesn't it kind of almost seem like something you would do in a dictatorship? Regardless of what the people wanted, if this is what we want to do and we're in charge, this is what we're going to do. Also, the Electoral College came to be as a compromise with the South, as a way to ensure that the South would be on board with the Constitution, with the new nation, because you had the issue of free states and slave states. And when you look at the South, they were at a huge disadvantage if you were just going to do it based off a popular vote, because such a large percentage of the population of the South were black slaves. And even under the Constitution, they were only counted as 3/5 of a person. On top of that, they didn't have the right to vote. You had a large percentage of the population in the South that was going to be on the sidelines, and as a result, that would automatically tilt the balance of the election to the North. So the Electoral College in part came to be as a way to ensure that there was more equal representation in the choice of selecting the next president of the United States. It was a way to appease the South. It was a way to allow the South to count its slaves as part of the population to increase the size overall of its representation. And ultimately it created a system where big states had the biggest influence, they had the most power, and that's why in 7 of the first 8 presidential elections, I believe it was, in this country, they were won by individuals from the state of Virginia, which was an incredibly wealthy state in the early days of the formation of this union. So it's important to understand that there were nefarious, you would argue, reasons for the Electoral College to ever come to be. And now you look at the system, and I think everybody acknowledges there are flaws and plenty of flaws. Now, maybe if you're a Donald Trump supporter or going back in the day, a George W. Bush supporter, maybe this doesn't bother you as much, but maybe it still does anyways. But there are a lot of flaws in the system. Let's look at it this way first. When you look at the electoral map, it's all about getting to 270 electoral votes. Whoever gets to 270 electoral votes, however they do it, is going to be the next president of the United States. That's the way it works. So, here's how ridiculous this system could be in theory. A presidential candidate could win California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Georgia, Michigan, North Carolina, and New Jersey, and get to 270 electoral votes. In 11 states, that candidate could become the president of the United States, meaning that they could, in theory, lose the other 39 states, along with Washington, D.C., that all have electoral votes on the map at play, and still win the election. Does that not seem fundamentally ridiculous? Does that not seem like it is giving way too much power to the larger states in this country? And I would think, from a Democratic standpoint, you wouldn't like it because, again, it's one of these things where you see the system potentially being rigged. But also, if you're a conservative or Republican, you shouldn't really like this because you look at it, this is part of the reason why heading into every election cycle, in theory, a Democratic candidate has a huge built-in advantage because California is deeply blue, New York is deeply blue, Illinois is deeply blue. For many years, Pennsylvania was blue, Michigan was blue. New Jersey is deeply blue. So all of a sudden you think about it and you say, if the Democratic candidate wins a Florida, you're in big trouble. If they also win in Ohio, you're in serious trouble. If a Democratic candidate ever won Texas or Georgia, it is pretty much good night fucking Irene. Now, fundamentally ridiculous that is to sit there and have a system in place where so few states potentially wield so much of the electoral power. And think of it this way as well. When you get into these type of situations, it's all about gerrymandering of the system and working within the system. The epitome of what sounds like a rigged system. A candidate can lose the popular vote. They can lose the popular vote and ultimately still become president of the United States. And that seems fundamentally ridiculous. It's not ridiculous in the sense of that's the way the system is currently set up, but just from a common sense standpoint, how did you win if you got overall less votes than the other individual? It just doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? Does it? Take away any political biases of being pissed about what happened with Al Gore in 2000 or being happy about Donald Trump being able to win in part because of the Electoral College system this go round. Let's think about that for a second. How ridiculous and frankly un-American does that really sound? A popular vote loser can win the election. Now, we could talk about the fact that the campaigns are run a certain way based off of the Electoral College match, and that's true. But what this ultimately does is it creates a system that's built for lower turnout and disenfranchisement. Let's think about this from the standpoint of some traditionally red states. Let's look at places like Alabama or Alaska or Idaho. If you're a Republican voter there, you don't feel like your vote really counts or matters that much because you know your state's going to ultimately go in this direction anyways. And if you're a Democratic voter in that state, no matter what you do, you feel like it's not going to matter anyway, so why bother participating? On the flip side, some of the traditionally blue states like California, New York, if you're a Democrat there, why would you feel need to engage in the process when you know pretty much how that state's going to break? And if you're a Republican in one of those states, God help you, what the hell are you supposed to do? If you vote, it really doesn't honestly matter. Forget all the propaganda and bullshit to try and con you into voting and contributing to this system. Your vote really doesn't matter that much because you know if you don't show up, the Democrats still win in that state. And if you do show up, the Democrats still win in that state by a big margin anyways. So under the context of that type of system, it's easy to understand why we can't even get 60% of our registered voters in this country to turn out for the presidential election. Why the hell would they? Because they feel like it doesn't matter because the system is set up against them. It's not in their favor. It disenfranchises them from the process. And frankly, it is the epitome in a lot of ways of a rigged system and has some anti-democratic type of origins to it, where you almost see where the founding fathers were willing to try the experiment of America, but at the same point in time didn't fully believe in it, coming from a world of monarchies that they grew up in and were a part of. It feels like it's a way, the ultimate checks and balances, to make sure that you could check the will of the people if you didn't like the will of the people's direction. Every other election we pretty much do in this country, from alderman and city council to mayor to state representatives to the governor's office to U.S. House of Representatives members and senators and every other voting process in between, are all pretty much done on person with the most votes wins. That seems to be a much more democratic way in theory, especially compared to the system that we currently have. But again, it's the system we've used forever. It's the only system that we know. And there are a lot of challenges to potentially changing said system. You're going to have opposition. You're going to have opponents that are going to fight you tooth and nail. And you also have some logistical challenges of if you change the way it was done, who's going to have oversight over this? How are you going to get it done? What is the way you're going to want to go? And these are fair and legitimate questions. So I wanted to take a moment here really quickly and talk about some of the possible alternatives to the Electoral College and see if any of these serve as better and more viable, beneficial options to determine our president than the Electoral Colleges. Now, I've heard a lot of suggestions over the years to do it by congressional district and say that whoever wins the congressional district gets that one electoral vote. You see a couple of states like Maine and New Hampshire where they do it where, with them being smaller states, they give 2 votes to the winner of the state and then 1 vote for the winner of each of the congressional districts. In Maine, there's 2 congressional districts. Nebraska, there's 3. So they give some power to not just winning the state, but they give just as much power, if not more so, to making sure that you win those individual congressional districts. And I get it and I understand it, but here's the problem if you went strictly off of the congressional districts. It would be heavily, incredibly slanted towards the GOP because there are so many rural, largely predominantly white counties within this country that the GOP would have such a huge built-in advantage that no Democratic or independent candidate would ever have a real chance. And while some people that are Republicans might think that's a great thing, at the end of the day, that's a horrible thing. Because we go from a 2-party dictatorship to a consolidation of power to where it ultimately would be really, in all intents and purposes, a 1-party democratic dictatorship. Where in theory you have a choice, but at the end of the day, it still doesn't matter because it's going to be a GOP man or woman every single time. That's not solving anything comparing to the Electoral College. It still doesn't do anything to encourage higher participation. If anything, it could potentially create even lower turnout. And it most certainly would disenfranchise a very sizable segment of the American population, both those not GOP and even some that are in the GOP. And on top of that, what's really concerning about it is you get the imbalance of the size of in the district. You could have a district with 10,000 people has the exact same sway as a district or a county that has 5 million people. Is that right? Does that make sense? Absolutely not. Why would this small segment of the population get more voice or the same voice in this particular case as this much more sizable portion of the population? It makes no sense. And on top of that, when you know at the state level that you could get a bunch of gerrymandering where you could even try to restrain whoever's in power certain segments of the population, and you see this a lot in certain states when they try to change the map to lump more black or Hispanic voters together in one different congressional district so that way they're not as spread out. This shit happens all the time. Imagine how frightening it would be if we had that type of gerrymandering going on every 4 years to keep one party in power in the White House. So the congressional district idea is completely ridiculous, and anybody that suggests that should be ashamed of themselves. Now, one kind of little hybrid off of the Electoral College that I've thought of in the past is the 1 state, 1 vote. And here's what I mean. If you win the state, like when Donald Trump won Pennsylvania, he get 1 electoral vote. When Hillary Clinton won Vermont, she gets 1 electoral vote. When Hillary Clinton wins Texas, California, she gets 1 electoral vote. Donald Trump wins Texas and Florida, he gets 1 electoral vote for each. You've got 50 states plus DC, so you could get to situations where it's 26, 25, and the way our system is, we do so much to keep third-party candidates out. You know, it pretty much prevents any real chance for a tie. It actually solves better for the potential for a tie better than the actual electoral college system currently set up is. And you look at it this way, it does give more states equal power and equal say in the process. States like Alaska and Vermont will have the same type of importance as a California, a Texas, a Florida. It means those states will matter more in the grand scheme of things, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. However, when you look at one state, one vote, you look at it and you have to say, where does it really solve for the turnout issue and the disenfranchisement? Because again, if you're in a state that votes so heavily Democratic or so heavily Republican, and you're either a Democrat or a Republican or an independent, it doesn't really matter. You're going to feel like, hey, my vote really doesn't matter no matter how much people try to tell me that it does. And you're probably right. And back to the congressional district thing, look at this from the state level. Should an Alaska or a Vermont really have the same type of sway in determining a presidential election as a Texas or a California or a Florida or New York? I don't think so. So that's not really a good solution either. To me, the best alternative to the Electoral College is a straight up popular vote. It ensures that every vote counts equally. The person in the most rural counties in Idaho matters every bit as much technically as the person in Broward County, Florida. Everyone has one vote. It doesn't matter if you win 30 states, but the other person only won 20, but they got more votes within the 20 states, and those are the 20 bigger states, and therefore they win. Every vote counts the same. To me, it would eliminate the problems with the current electoral college system of decreasing turnout and increased disenfranchisement because of the fact that every vote would matter. It doesn't matter if you're in Idaho or Montana or Wyoming or Vermont or Delaware or Rhode Island or California or Texas or Hawaii or Florida or Georgia or wherever the hell else. Your vote counts just as much as the next person. Your one vote counts the same across the board as everybody else's does. It seems like an incredibly fair democratic way to do it, does it not? So therefore, as a result, I think it would lead to more involvement in the process, more interest in the process, more empowerment of the people in the process, and would create an incentive to ultimately get much higher turnout. Again, when you hear something like a Donald Trump and his supporters talking about he has a mandate, he won the Electoral College, yes, but he couldn't even get 50% of the popular vote. He didn't win the popular vote. That's not exactly a mandate of any damn thing. And furthermore, even if you said Hillary Clinton won with 350 electoral votes, just in the interest of fairness, if the turnout of registered voters is less than 60%, and she won maybe 52% of the popular vote, that means she won 52% of only less than 60% of the actual electorate. That's over 40% of the electorate that's on the sidelines, that's not involved in the process. That's not a mandate for any damn thing, because that is far less than a majority of the registered voting population of the country. It would force candidates to run 50-state campaigns. It would force candidates to have to compete everywhere. It would get more people involved everywhere. And you would have to address issues everywhere. When you get into the election cycle every 4 years, it's all about swing states, toss-ups, and battlegrounds. So at the end of the day, you tailor-make your campaign according to, what the voters in Ohio or Florida or Pennsylvania give a shit about. Well, what they give a shit about might not be the same thing that somebody in Utah gives a shit about, or Washington State or Oregon gives a shit about. Why should they have to sit on the sidelines, and why should these other states seem to be so much more important and so much more vital to the process when that's not the way it should be? It just shouldn't be. So, if you're asking me, in theory, should the Electoral College be abolished? The simple answer is yes. And I think to answer otherwise, in theory, from a theoretical basis, is fucking ridiculous. Why the hell would you want to have this process in place with all of its flaws and no, doing it the way we've always done it is not a good fucking reason to continue to do it. Because if we use that logic for this country, that would mean blacks would still have to live under Jim Crow segregation in the South. That would mean that women would not have the right to vote. That would mean all types of different freaking things. Slavery was the way of the world for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. Just because that was the way it was always done doesn't mean it was ever right and should continue and should be re-implemented today. Now, again, there are major logistical challenges with trying to sit there and put in a purely popular vote system. You know, you also have to think about if candidates actually had to run campaigns in 50 states, that means that they're actually, if you're an incumbent, you're not doing your job very much the last year and a half or two. So would you have to explore changing the way the presidency is structured in terms of maybe 1 6-year term, like I believe they do down in Mexico, as opposed to 2 potentially 4-year terms, and that's it? Because you lose so much of your active presidency campaigning, you would basically be the campaigner in chief, and that's not the way it should be. You also have the logistics of, do we really want to let some of these idiots in some of these individual states handle this crap? With the problems we have with voter machines and the occasional blips on the radar of voter fraud? Do we really want that to come into play in a major way in a popular vote election? Absolutely not. And could we trust the federal government to actually oversee this and make sure that the process runs swimmingly? Why should we trust the federal government to do anything? But at the end of the day, the best solution, and I think the only real solution, is to go to a popular vote system and abolish the Electoral College. Just because that's the way it's always been doesn't mean that it's ever been right, or that's the way it should continue to be. We've had 5 times now, including this most recent election, 5 times in our history where the person who won the popular vote lost the presidency. There just seems to be something fundamentally wrong with that. There seems to be something fundamentally wrong with over 40% of the registered voters in this country not showing up because at the end of the day, you could say, well, maybe they just don't care about the candidates. No, maybe they're just not invested in the process because they don't think their vote fucking matters. And in a lot of states, honestly, it really, really doesn't based off of the way the system is set up. So we have a system that is in place that encourages lower turnout, disenfranchises large swaths of the registered voting base. And on top of all of that, let's just say in theory, Donald Trump wins the Electoral College, which he has done. But all of a sudden, you have a bunch of electors in the Electoral College go rogue, which for most of these states they can do with little or no penalty whatsoever. And they say, yeah, he won the Electoral College, but we like Hillary Clinton better, so she should be the next president. That's just fucking wrong. It'd be the same thing. Hillary Clinton wins the Electoral College, and all of a sudden, somebody says, oh, we don't want to vote for her. You get a bunch of rogue electors, and then Donald Trump is the president. And again, that's fucking wrong, too. That is ultimately circumventing the will of the freaking people. Ask John Quincy Adams how that worked out for him going against Andrew Jackson. We've got to get rid of this Electoral College. I mean, I'm sure so many other countries around the world that actually have free democratic elections where the person that wins the most votes wins looks at the way we determine our president and say, what in the fuck type of American bullshit is this? That's exactly what it is. It is American bullshit. It is a protection built into the system by the establishment, another layer of infrastructure of protection to make sure that the powers that be, if they so desired, still ultimately had that power to circumvent and overcome and overpower the will of the people. And by establishing the system that we do have, it accomplishes that by discouraging voter turnout and discouraging involvement in the process and discouraging half of the states from frankly being in any way relevant every 4 years when we determine the president via a presidential election. There's something wrong with that. And I don't care if you supported Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or somebody else in this particular campaign cycle. I don't care. You have to understand how ridiculous this system is, how flawed the system is, and how badly it truly needs to change. It's not going to change, though, because at the end of the day, as stupid of a country as we are, not just in the choices of the people that we put in positions of power, but just in the way we are. We'll complain about it. We'll talk about it. We'll bitch about it. And everybody will acknowledge